I was driving my sister home after dinner when she suddenly asked, "Have you ever noticed how he looks at you?" I glanced at her in surprise and replied, "Who do you mean?" Her smile was slight and secretive as she continued, "Your stepfather, Robert. Have you noticed he looks at you as if there's something more in his eyes?" Her words trailed off, leaving a question in the air that I couldn't quite place. I laughed lightly, trying to brush off what I assumed was just playful teasing. "What nonsense, he's just being attentive as usual," I said, not giving her remark much thought. Yet during the rest of the drive, her words echoed in my mind. I couldn't help but replay the conversation, wondering if there was any truth behind her observation. The roads were quiet that night, and the soft hum of the engine provided a steady background to my thoughts. I recalled my friend's tone and the hint of mischief in her eyes as she had spoken. Although I was sure that Robert's behavior had always been normal and measured, a small uneasiness began to settle within me. I tried to focus on the familiar route home, but the question lingered. When I pulled into the driveway, the cool night air felt refreshing, yet I couldn't shake the nagging thought of her words. I stepped out of the car and unlocked the front door. Inside, the house was silent and calm, as it usually was at this hour. I made my way into the living room, and that's when I noticed him. Robert was sitting on the sofa, absorbed in his phone. Even though he seemed lost in what he was reading, I was sure he had seen me enter. I paused for a moment, watching him as I crossed the room. There was a quiet intensity in his gaze, a look that I hadn't fully registered before. I dismissed the feeling, reminding myself that I'd always seen him as a steady presence in my life. Still, a part of me wondered if my friend's comment held a grain of truth. I moved toward the kitchen to put away the dishes from earlier, my mind still lingering on the conversation from the car. The house was in its usual order, with everything in its place, but tonight the familiar surroundings felt charged with a subtle tension. I tried to convince myself that there was nothing unusual, that it was just my imagination fueled by an offhand remark. After a few minutes, I heard soft footsteps coming from upstairs. My mother had gone to prepare for bed, leaving me alone with my thoughts, and it seemed with Robert as well. I began tidying up, trying to ignore the persistent feeling that something wasn't entirely right. I moved from one task to the next, yet I couldn't clear my mind of the unsettling memory of my friend's question and the strange look I thought I'd seen in Robert's eyes. Then, as I was finishing up in the kitchen, Robert's voice broke the silence. "You're late," he said in a calm, almost routine tone. I turned around quickly, startled by the suddenness of his presence. He stood there with a composed expression, and for a moment I wasn't sure what to say. His calmness contrasted with the tension I felt inside. Before I could find my voice, Robert stepped closer and gently touched my shoulder. The contact was light, almost incidental, yet it sent a shock through me. "Something interesting happened today?" he asked in a low voice. The question was simple, yet his tone carried a weight that made the kitchen feel smaller and the air heavier. For a split second, his hand remained on my shoulder longer than I would have expected in a casual family setting. I felt my heart beat faster as I tried to process what was happening. I was aware of every small detail, the coolness of his hand, the calm steadiness of his voice, and the slight intensity in his eyes. I managed a quick reply, "No, nothing out of the ordinary," even though inside I was reeling from the unexpected intimacy of the moment. As I spoke, I realized that the ordinary words and gestures were slowly stirring a storm of confusion in my mind. My thoughts drifted back to my friend's comment earlier that evening. Had I really missed something obvious? Was there a hidden meaning behind the way Robert looked at me when I entered the house? Every detail of the evening now seemed to carry significance. The conversation ended as quickly as it had begun. Robert's hand slipped away, and I was left standing in the kitchen, the silence resuming its usual form. I looked down at my shoulder, as if expecting to find a clue in the lingering warmth of his touch. Instead, I found only questions. I returned to my routine, trying to convince myself that it was all just an overreaction, a misinterpretation of a simple, everyday interaction. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't help but replay the events over and over again. I remembered the way my friend's words had sounded during our drive, the unspoken implication behind them. I recalled the moment I saw Robert on the sofa and the odd feeling that came with his steady gaze. And most of all, I remembered the touch on my shoulder, a touch that, although brief, left me with a sense of both familiarity and unease. I turned these thoughts over in my mind, trying to make sense of them in a logical way. Robert had always been a part of my daily life, a reliable presence in a household that had known its share of challenges. I had never questioned his behavior until that moment in the kitchen. Now, every gesture and every glance seemed to hint at a secret I was not meant to understand. I promised myself that I would pay closer attention in the coming days. I resolved to observe his behavior, to note any small detail that might explain the subtle shift. I knew that I was not one to jump to conclusions, yet the memory of that encounter nagged at me. It was as if something had shifted in our everyday interactions, a quiet signal that something interesting, or perhaps even dangerous, was unfolding beneath the surface of our routine lives. Even as I drifted off to sleep, the question remained with me: was it all in my head, or was there a deeper truth hidden behind Robert's calm demeanor? I couldn't be sure, but one thing was clear: this was only the beginning. There was an undercurrent of tension in the air, a promise that the following days might reveal secrets I wasn't ready to face. And as I closed my eyes, I silently wondered what the next encounter would bring, knowing that the simple moments of everyday life could hide unexpected turns. Eventually, the night grew quiet again, leaving me with a mind full of unanswered questions and a heart that raced with anticipation and uncertainty. Every small sound in the house felt amplified, every shadow a potential sign of something more. I lay there, determined to keep a careful watch on every detail, fully aware that sometimes the most unremarkable moments could lead to revelations that would change everything. Then, just as the clock neared the early hours, I remembered the earlier part of the night with vivid clarity. I recalled the moment when, after my mother had gone upstairs, Robert had stopped me in the kitchen. His voice had been unremarkable, a simple remark, "You're late." Yet immediately after, his hand had reached out, touching my shoulder, as he asked, "Something interesting happened today." His words were ordinary, but something in his voice made me feel the air grow heavier. His fingers lingered on my shoulder just a moment longer than was appropriate, and I couldn't help but think that what came next might be even more intriguing. Over the next few days after that unsettling moment in the kitchen, I deliberately kept my distance from Robert. I convinced myself that I was simply overreacting, that I was imagining things that weren't really there. I limited our interactions to the bare minimum, sticking to the usual tasks and avoiding any chance for a more personal conversation. Despite my efforts, Robert found ways to be alone with me. One afternoon, as I was organizing a few items in the hallway, he approached me with a casual request. "Could you help me move some boxes to the garage?" he asked in a steady tone. I hesitated for a moment before agreeing, hoping that the task would be simple and brief. We walked to the garage together, and I focused on the physical work rather than the underlying tension between us. In the garage, we lifted and shifted boxes without much conversation. Robert maintained a calm demeanor, but I couldn't shake the feeling that his actions were calculated. Once we finished moving the boxes, he mentioned another errand. "I want to show you something," he said, leading me to a small storage room. There, he pulled out an old camera from a dusty shelf. The camera was an outdated model, clearly something he had kept for years. He pointed the camera toward me and said, "You always look so beautiful in photos." As he spoke, his fingers brushed against mine to study the device. The contact was brief, but felt too intimate for a casual demonstration. I froze, caught off guard by the closeness. Instinctively, I pulled my hand back and stepped away. "Mom called," I said sharply, using the excuse to leave the room immediately. I retreated to the hallway, my mind racing with conflicting thoughts. Part of me wanted to dismiss the incident as nothing more than a clumsy moment, but another part of me couldn't help questioning his motives. Robert's persistence troubled me. His repeated attempts to create opportunities for us to be alone were difficult to ignore, and I began to wonder if I was missing something important. The following day, I made every effort to keep our interactions strictly professional. I stayed in public areas of the house and kept our conversations short, yet Robert's behavior continued to blur the lines. In the late morning, while I was preparing a cup of tea in the kitchen, he casually mentioned, "I need help rearranging items in the study." "I'd appreciate your help if you have a few minutes," he said with a neutral tone. I agreed, not wanting to create any tension by refusing, even though I felt a knot of apprehension forming in my stomach. In the study, we worked side by side. Robert's questions about the placement of books or the order of documents seemed ordinary enough, yet his occasional linger and gaze made the atmosphere uncomfortably charged. I concentrated on sorting the papers, keeping my thoughts firmly on the task at hand. Despite my outward composure, I felt increasingly conflicted. Part of me was drawn to his confidence, while another part remained wary of his intentions. As the day wore on, I noticed that Robert was intentionally inserting himself into my routines. Every request for assistance, no matter how trivial, brought us into closer proximity. I began to question whether my growing curiosity about him was a reaction to his behavior or if there was something inherently compelling about him that I hadn't recognized before. I reminded myself to stay focused on my own responsibilities, but the uncertainty lingered. That evening, while I sat alone in the living room after dinner, I replayed the events of the past few days in my mind. The memory of his gentle touch and the remark about the photos kept resurfacing. I wasn't sure whether I was being too cautious or if I was in danger of misinterpreting harmless actions. I decided that I would continue to keep my distance and observe his behavior without getting involved emotionally. However, Robert's actions suggested that he had his own plans. The next time we were alone was when I was tidying up near the study area. He entered the room unexpectedly and said, "I need help organizing some more items." There was nothing overt in his tone, yet his eyes carried a message that I couldn't ignore. I assisted him, but I kept our interactions strictly task-focused, careful not to encourage any further closeness. Throughout these encounters, I found myself analyzing every detail of his behavior. Was his insistence on being alone with me merely a coincidence, or was it an attempt to signal something deeper? I tried to rationalize the situation, but the consistent pattern of his actions made it difficult to dismiss entirely. Robert's persistence was becoming a source of internal conflict. I felt a pull to understand him better, even as I maintained a clear boundary to protect myself. By the end of the day, as I returned to my room, I realized that the issue was far from resolved. Robert's calculated behavior, whether innocent or not, had disrupted the normal rhythm of our daily interactions. I resolved to be extra cautious and to limit my exposure to situations where I might be alone with him. Yet even as I set this boundary, I couldn't completely silence the part of me that was curious about his intentions. That evening, the house was quiet, and I sat reviewing the events in my mind. I knew that avoiding him entirely might not be possible, as he seemed determined to remain a constant presence in my life. The challenge now was to understand what was driving his behavior without letting it disrupt the order I had tried to maintain. I understood that this was more than a simple misunderstanding. It was a situation that demanded careful observation and thoughtful action. I ended the day with a cautious plan to continue keeping my interactions with Robert brief and focused on necessary tasks only, while remaining alert to any changes in his behavior. Deep down, I also wondered if there was something more behind his actions, something that could explain the unexpected intimacy of his touch and his repeated efforts to spend time with me. Whatever the case, I knew that the coming days would likely bring further complications and revelations. As I prepared for bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was escalating. Robert's actions had set a pattern that was hard to ignore, and I was aware that this was only the beginning of a more complicated chapter in our lives. The unanswered questions and the tension between us promised that soon there would be no turning back from the path we had unwittingly started down. A month had passed, and we had both maintained a careful distance. We silently agreed not to cross any boundaries, but I sensed that it was only a matter of time before that unspoken agreement was tested. With my mother away on a business trip, the house felt emptier, and the isolation between Robert and me grew more pronounced. Despite knowing the risks, I chose to stay, relying on routine to keep things under control. That Friday evening, Robert suggested we watch a movie as he prepared the popcorn in the microwave. His tone was steady and unremarkable. I sat on the couch beside him, determined to focus on the film rather than the subtle shifts in our interactions. The room was quiet except for the low hum of the microwave and the soft dialogue from the television. As the movie played, I noticed that Robert's behavior had become more deliberate. In a sudden, unanticipated move, he placed his hand on my knee. I paused internally at the unexpected contact, but did not immediately react. "Are you cold?" he asked in a calm, even tone, his hand remaining in place. His fingers shifted slightly upward, and I tried to keep my eyes on the screen, hoping to mask the discomfort I felt. For a moment, I considered removing his hand, but something inside urged me to remain still. Robert leaned in a bit closer, lowering his voice as he whispered, "If something is wrong, you can tell me." His words came across as a direct challenge, and I felt the boundary between what was acceptable and what was not beginning to blur. I stayed silent, caught between a need to uphold the unspoken rules and a reluctant curiosity about where this might lead. Inside, I wrestled with conflicting thoughts. I had always been cautious around Robert, mindful of the limits we had both agreed to respect, yet tonight his gentle, yet assertive touch and his probing questions stirred feelings that I found difficult to ignore. I considered speaking up or shifting away, but neither option felt entirely right at that moment. The steady ticking of the clock and the muted sounds from the movie underscored the gravity of the situation. Robert's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the tension building inside me. His casual inquiry did not come with anger or overt affection, it was simply a statement that left the next move up to me. I weighed my options silently. Should I reinforce the distance we had maintained, or should I allow this subtle shift to continue despite the risk? The decision was not clear, and the quiet of the room seemed to amplify the importance of every passing second. I remained seated, processing his words and the unexpected physical closeness. The situation was shifting from a routine evening into something more complex. I realized that the weekend, now marked by this quiet yet significant moment, might change the course of our interactions. As I sat there, the line between right and wrong grew increasingly indistinct. In that tense, silent pause, as Robert's hand rested on my knee and his whispered challenge lingered in the air, I knew that nothing would remain the same after tonight. Saturday had arrived, and everything had grown uncontrollable. After breakfast, Robert entered my room carrying a cup of coffee. He paused at the doorway, his eyes fixed on me, and said, "You haven't been out for a long time." He then moved to sit on the edge of my bed, his gaze steady and heavy, and I found myself unable to look away. I sat there quietly for a moment before finally speaking. "What are you doing, Robert?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper as my heart pounded in my chest. The question hung in the air, and I waited for his answer. He met my eyes without hesitation. "What we both want," he replied in a calm, assured tone. His voice left little room for misinterpretation, and as he spoke, I felt the tension in the room rise steadily. Robert leaned in closer, his face drawing near mine, as he reached out and gently touched my cheek. His touch was measured and deliberate. Then, almost imperceptibly, his fingers slid down to my neck. For a long, suspended moment, I did not protest. Instead of saying no, I reached out and grasped his hand, holding it firmly. In that instant, I realized that something between us was unfolding that we could no longer control. I sat still, my mind racing with conflicting thoughts, even as my body responded to his touch. The silence that followed was punctuated only by our shallow breaths and the faint sound of the door closing behind him. I was aware that the careful distance we had maintained for so long was now being erased by a series of small, deliberate actions. Robert's hand remained on my neck for a few more seconds before he slowly withdrew it, yet the implication of his gesture lingered. "Are you sure this is what you want?" I managed to ask, my voice steadier than I felt, trying to balance my own uncertainty with the clear signals he had already given. His eyes held a quiet intensity as he looked at me, and for a moment all I could see was the reflection of my own conflicted expression. "I have been sure for a long time," he replied simply. His tone was even, leaving little doubt about his conviction. Despite the logic of our unspoken agreement to remain cautious, his words stirred something deep within me. I knew that our actions in recent days had been measured and careful, but this moment marked a clear departure from that restraint. I shifted slightly on the bed, trying to reconcile my inner doubts with the undeniable pull of the situation. My rational mind reminded me of the boundaries we had set, boundaries designed to protect us from the complications of blurred relationships, yet as I held Robert's hand, I realized that those boundaries were dissolving before my eyes. The decision to continue, once a distant possibility, now felt imminent. Robert's expression softened for a brief moment, and he slowly moved his hand back toward my face. "I need you to understand," he said quietly, "this is not a mistake. We both know what we want." His words were clear and firm, yet they carried an undercurrent of vulnerability that I had not expected. It was as if he was trying to convince both of us that the inevitable was right, even though it carried risks. The room felt charged with a tension that was both new and familiar. I could feel the steady rhythm of my heart, and each beat reminded me that the decision we were making was far from simple. I took a slow breath, trying to steady myself while the weight of the moment pressed down. Robert's presence was undeniable, and his calm persistence left little room for retreat. For several minutes, we sat in silence. The unspoken question of whether to continue or pull back hung in the space between us. Every small gesture, every glance, contributed to a growing momentum that neither of us could easily stop. I found myself caught between caution and an unexpected desire to embrace the change that was unfolding in that quiet pause. As our eyes met again, I sensed that the choice had already been made. The deliberate act of holding his hand was not just a physical gesture, it was a turning point. I realized that by not saying no, I was allowing the situation to evolve beyond the limits we had once set. Even as my mind argued against it, my body was signaling a readiness to proceed. Robert's gaze remained fixed on mine, and his hand, still warm from contact, continued to offer a silent promise. I could no longer pretend that nothing had changed. The air in the room felt heavier, the distance between us erased by our mutual actions. I knew that we had reached a moment where caution had given way to something more potent, something that we had both desired yet feared. In that final, decisive moment, as I maintained my hold on his hand, I felt it clearly. Something between us was unfolding that we could no longer control. Robert closed the door behind him, and I heard the lock click quietly. The sound made my heart beat faster. I stood by the window, watching the night city, yet I could not ignore his lingering presence in the room. Soon, he approached. His steps were almost silent, as if he were a predator moving in the dark. "We're alone," he said in a low, deep voice. There was an edge of danger in his tone, mixed with an unspoken excitement I couldn't quite define. He circled me slowly, and his hands reached out to my shoulders. His fingers lightly brushed my collarbone, and I caught my breath at the unexpected contact. Leaning closer, he whispered, "Do you feel it?" His lips were so near my ear that I felt a subtle warmth spreading through me from his words. I turned to face him, and our eyes met in a silence that spoke louder than any words could. Without a word, his hand moved to my chin and gently lifted my face, forcing me to meet his gaze. In that moment, I couldn't tell whether his eyes held pure desire or a trace of uncertainty. "If you don't want this, say it now," he said, his voice trembling slightly with restrained passion. But even as he spoke, he did not let go of me. I remained silent. It wasn't that I lacked the words. Part of me wanted this just as much as he did. He began moving deliberately, as if testing the limits of our unspoken agreement. His hand slid to the tie of my robe, and before I could react, he unfastened it. My robe fell to the floor, revealing the simple pajama beneath. I noticed his gaze moved downward, and my face flushed with awareness. "You look so beautiful," he murmured quietly. His hands then rested on my waist, and instead of pushing him away, I held my breath, waiting for his next move. I reached for his shirt, and he did not resist. His eyes, heavy with desire, followed as I began to unbutton it one by one. The buttons came undone until the fabric slipped from his shoulders, leaving him exposed in a way that made our proximity even more intense. Now standing so close that I could feel the heat of his body, his scent, and the rhythm of his breathing, his hands found their way to my thigh and began to move upward. I held my breath, not stopping him, even as my heart pounded loudly. "I have never wanted anything so much," he confessed in a low tone that carried the weight of a sincere admission. Leaning in further, our faces nearly touched. I felt his lips graze my forehead, then my cheek, and his hand moved from my chin down to my neck. Then everything abruptly stopped. A sudden chill washed over me, an alarming, cold sensation that made my body freeze. My mind screamed that this was wrong, that it was a catastrophic mistake in the making. "Robert, stop," I managed to whisper, barely exhaling the words. He froze too, his eyes widening as they met mine in shock. "What happened?" he asked, though his hand still held on to me, as if fearing I might pull away. I struggled to steady my voice. This is a mistake." Tears welled in my eyes as I stepped back and retrieved my fallen robe from the floor. "We can't do this. It will ruin everything," I insisted, my voice trembling with the certainty of my decision. "But you wanted this," he said softly, his tone laced with a pained vulnerability that suggested he was on the verge of losing something irreplaceable. "I thought I did," I replied, trying to steady the rising tide of emotion, "but it's wrong. I can't. We can't." His head dropped slightly as he searched for the right words, but no explanation came. Then he simply nodded. "Okay, but I wanted you to know it was real for me." With that, he turned and left the room, the sound of his footsteps and the closing door echoing in the tense silence. I sat on the bed for what felt like an eternity, curled up in my robe, feeling my heart contract with a mix of guilt and fear. I stood by the window once more, staring out at the city lights and the dark sky, trying to process the gravity of what had just happened. The encounter had shattered the carefully maintained boundaries we had both observed for so long. Every touch, every whispered word, had led us here, to a point of no return. I knew that this moment would forever change our relationship and possibly everything in our household. The silence in the room was heavy with the consequences of our actions. I could hear nothing but my own breathing and the distant hum of the city below. Every small sound reminded me of the stark reality. We had crossed a line we could never uncross. I was overwhelmed by the responsibility of the choices made in that brief span of time. The unspoken rules and the cautious distance we had once maintained were now irreparably broken. My mind raced with the implications, how this event would affect the dynamics at home, the potential fallout from a relationship that was never meant to go beyond the boundaries we had set. I felt trapped by a mixture of regret, fear, and the lingering memory of desire. I knew I had to face the consequences of this moment, no matter how painful or disruptive they might be. In the quiet aftermath, I resolved to think through the next steps carefully. Should I confront Robert about what had happened, or should I try to bury the incident and hope it would fade away with time? The weight of the secret and the breach of trust loomed large. I recognized that my actions, and his, had opened a door to a future filled with uncertainty, one that could either mend or permanently fracture the life we had known. As I sat there processing the tumult of emotions and thoughts, a final clarity began to form. I understood that although the encounter had felt real and passionate in the moment, it was ultimately a mistake. I could not allow it to define my life or disrupt the delicate balance we had maintained. The consequences of our actions were already in motion, and there was no simple way to undo what had been done. Robert had left, and I remained sitting on the bed, curled up in my robe, feeling my heart contract with guilt and fear.